Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. Thucydides has been in the news a lot lately. Yet again. He appeared in several headlines following last week's high-stakes summit in Beijing between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Trump. During their bilateral meetings, President Xi directly invoked the so-called Thucydides trap, a concept coined by Harvard scholar Graham Allison to describe the alleged historical tendency toward war when a rising power threatens to displace an established hegemon. In Allison's framework, the U.S. is the established power, the Sparta in the relationship, while China is the nimble, innovative newcomer, Athens. I won't get into how controversial this concept is among both IR scholars and classicists, but I just mention it to point out that Thucydides is in the air. And before that, there was Greenland. This past January, when there were rumblings about a possible U.S. seizure of Greenland, the Athenian ring to the rhetoric wasn't lost on Thucydideans. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller told CNN's Jake Tapper, quote, "We live in a world, in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power." He went on to say, "These are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time." So when I first heard that, I was struck by how strongly Miller's rhetoric echoed the Athenian articulation of what we think of today as political realism in Thucydides' Melian dialogue. You know, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must and all that. And I wasn't alone. Articles from the New York Times to CNN to History Today, all sorts of outlets, all quickly made the Thucydidean connection. This is all, of course, nothing new. Thucydides is usually considered the founding father of, among other things, the field of IR. But he also has a lot to say about what goes on within individual political communities. And I've been finding myself surprised lately that there aren't more think pieces out there, given the era that we're living in, about Thucydides' famous account of the Stasis, the moment of civil discord that tore Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, apart during the Peloponnesian War. While ancient Greek stasis might not be in the headlines, it is the topic of a brand new book by my guest for this episode, Scott Lawin Arcenas, the author of Political Violence in Ancient Greece, Quantitative and Qualitative Approaches to Stasis, 500 to 301 BCE, which was published earlier this year by Cambridge University Press. In the book, Scott reshapes how we understand stasis in classical Greece. He blends quantitative and historical analysis to argue that stasis in the classical Greek world actually occurred with high frequency, but surprisingly low levels of mass violence. Ultimately, Scott presents a compelling but counterintuitive thesis that stasis in a way was a net contributor to the institutional innovation, economic growth, and cultural flourishing of the ancient Greek polis. That's a conclusion that you would never draw just from a reading of Thucydides, and certainly not from the famous Book 3 passage on the stasis at Corcyra. But I personally take much more solace in Scott's analysis of how ancient Greek communities managed to survive and even thrive amid polarization. Scott Lawin Arcenas is a historian and classicist who specializes in the history of democracy and political violence. His first book, Political Violence in Ancient Greece, Quantitative and Qualitative Approaches to Stasis, 500 to 301 BCE, reveals the nature, frequency, and intensity of political violence in 5th and 4th century Greek city-states. He holds degrees from Princeton, Cambridge, and Stanford, and is currently an associate professor of history and classics at the University of Montana. Just a quick note to listeners that, as ever, I have put some references in the show notes for this episode, and yet another reminder that Lesche is on Instagram at Lesche Podcasts, so you might want to give us a follow there and tell your friends. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Scott Lawin Arcenas. The next voice you'll be hearing is his.
This project, I think it's important to say this up front, this project was my dissertation. And when I think about what made me want to kind of do this project, or maybe what made me want to study stasis in general, I kind of think in terms of a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that stasis is just, it's interesting, it's important, and it's quite poorly understood, which are basically my three criteria for any research project. But I think the longer answer is probably more interesting. And as a graduate student, I was really stuck by two open questions in the scholarship on stasis. We really didn't know how frequent stasis was, and we also really didn't know how much violence was typically involved in a given episode of stasis. And this posed a big problem for me as a graduate student because I wanted to write a paper on the way that stasis impacted the Greek economy. And I was at least toying with a dissertation about the way that stasis impacted the broader development of Greek society. But when I started to try and write this paper, I soon realized that it was just impossible to talk about the effects of stasis without having some idea of how likely individual Greeks would have been to experience stasis, or how likely they might have been to die or be sent into exile or something like that when a stasis occurred. And for a long time, I found this very frustrating because it forced me to abandon a research question that I really wanted to answer. But eventually, though, and with some help from colleagues and mentors, I kind of came to realize that this was actually a great opportunity to address two more interesting questions. And also that if I was able to answer them effectively, I could always write the paper on stasis and economic growth later on.
Could you maybe just start for us by explaining what stasis is? Because I'm someone who works on Thucydides quite a bit, but even in that literature, I mean, of course, there are books on it, and maybe we'll talk about one or two of those. But for your purposes, what is stasis? How do we even define it?
So here again, there are two questions, or there are two answers, I guess is better to say. And if we zoom out and consider stasis in its broadest sense, it's a conflict among the constituent parts of a composite unit, as long as that occurrence, that conflict poses a threat to the unit as a whole. And I think one of the most interesting things about stasis, right, this sounds very, very abstract, and it is very abstract, because stasis is not an inherently political phenomenon, right? It can occur in a variety of composite units. It can occur in a body, in a soul, in an army, in an empire, kind of anything that's a composite unit that has individual parts. And the crucial thing here is that these aren't metaphorical uses, the way we might today talk about, say, a civil war within a political party or a civil war within, a baseball team. Insofar as we can tell, right, a bad stomachache was just as much of a stasis as the political variety that I write about. So that's the big picture answer. If we focus specifically on political stasis, though, and to be clear, that's really what I do in the book, stasis is a violent conflict among the citizens of a polis in which one or more factions seeks to seize or consolidate control over the polis as a whole. So it's really a struggle for power among the citizens of a polis.
Why is it not strictly speaking a civil war? How does the term overlap with the concept of the civil war, and where is it different in the context of conflict within a single polis?
Yeah, so civil war, I guess, to back up, stasis is translated in a variety of different ways. Back in the day, it was often translated as faction, but I'd say today, civil war is the most common translation. I think it's a misleading translation, but I think it's a good comparison because it reveals some really fundamental differences between these two phenomena. And the most obvious difference is just the scale of the phenomenon. A typical stasis might involve a few dozen inhabitants, and you would rarely involve more than a few hundred, whereas civil wars tend to have at least tens of thousands of combatants and sometimes many millions. And we see the same thing if we think of duration. A lot of stasis tended to last a few hours to a few days, whereas civil wars tend to last months, years, and sometimes even decades. But I think that there are other interesting ways in which the comparison is really revealing. And one of them is just if we look at etymology, civil war or bellum civile, right, is etymologically linked to both the concept of war, bellum, and both the cives, or citizens, and the civitas, or kind of the polity or city-state. And stasis has no etymological connection to the Greek equivalents whatsoever, right? There's nothing about polis, politei, or polemos. And right, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, right, stasis is something that could occur in any composite unit. And I think this is deeply significant because it suggests that the Greeks conceptualized, stasis and this variety of political conflict in a really different way, something that, at least on a linguistic level, actually has more in common with a soul torn between two conflicting desires than a war between independent polis. And if we actually see this play out in the way that stasiotai, that is the participants in stasis, in the way that stasiotai conducted themselves, right? The participants in civil wars, they tend to employ the symbols that are often associated with wars, right? They wear the uniforms, they carry the flags or maybe the standards if we're talking about the original Roman context, with only a few exceptions, and these tend to be the exceptions that are more like civil war. Stasiotite don't seem to have done this. They really avoid the symbols that are associated with polemos. They don't erect trophies after a victory. And also the types of violence they tended to use tend to be irregular. It's things like surprise attacks, chucking roof tiles at each other. They aren't usually engaging in hoplite combat or cavalry charges.
So we're not talking about pitched battles on open fields or anything like that.
Yeah, very rare. This does happen. So we see this, for example, at Athens in 44403. We see this actually a lot at Syracuse. So Syracuse is the place where you tend to have a lot of these things that look much more like war. But a typical stasis, it tends to occur in the urban environment, and it's places where you don't have the time really to prepare for pitched battles and that type of thing, but you also aren't in a good location for it. You're not out on broad level ground where you can get organized and actually push against each other in a hoplite fashion.
So what is our earliest evidence for the emergence of this conception of stasis?
So that's a tricky question to answer. I think we can see it already in Homer. So, right, if we think of, the Odyssey, right, there's a way that you can think of the Odyssey as a stasis narrative, right? Towards the end of the epic, you basically end up with the household of Odysseus fighting for control of Ithaca against the suitors and their retainers, etc. And even though some of the suitors are not from Ithaca, a lot of them are, and Homer describes the suitors as Ithacans a lot. So he kind of emphasizes, he kind of frames them as being Ithacans on the one hand. So I think that, Homer frames that particular conflict as a stasis. And, right, I talked about the fact that we can think of stasis happening in armies, and I think you can read the Iliad also as a stasis narrative as well. So I think, we can certainly go back to Homer if we look, if we're looking for the earliest attested evidence. That would probably be my winner.
So what led you, though, to focus on this period 500 to 300? So we're roughly talking about what we conceive of as the classical period with some expansion of those bookends on both sides.
Yeah, so this was really a practical decision. This wasn't, a theoretical perspective, or it's not that I'm saying something's unique about the 5th and 4th centuries. It's really a product of the evidence and the way that the kind of my method I developed to estimate stasis frequency. My arguments about frequency really rely on my ability to map the chronological and the geographic distribution of evidence around the Greek world. And this is something that I can do for the 4th and 5th century because the sources are relatively consistent. We've got narrative historians like Thucydides, Herodotus, Diodorus, Xenophon. We've got Aristotle. We've got a lot of the people who play big roles in Plutarch's lives. We've got Aeneas, Tacticus, and the orators. And these allow me to kind of map that evidence relatively easily. When I tried to push it a little bit further back to the Archaic period, the evidence changes in two really important ways. And in the first place, we're much more reliant on alternative sources, especially lyric poetry, stuff like Alcaeus. And basically, it also becomes a lot tougher to date our sources with the necessary level of specificity. And so, again, this is a pragmatic decision, and I really want to just emphasize that this is not me saying that stasis is less important in the Archaic period, that though I can't prove this, I think it was just as frequent and just as important in the Archaic period. I think Hans von Wees has made a really persuasive argument to this effect in an important article that he wrote back in 2008. And I think if we look at Athens, which wasn't yet the total outlier that it would later become, Athens certainly experiences stasis at the rate that I claim to be typical throughout the whole 6th century.
You outline criteria for a conflict to be really counted as a stasis proper. Could you just run through those?
I want to clarify one thing before I get to the criteria themselves, and that this is just that having strict criteria is really important for conducting big picture surveys where you're dealing with a lot of different evidence, and especially when you're dealing with evidence like the evidence that I have to work with, which is deeply uncertain. I have so many kind of cases where I know a tiny bit about one of these episodes, but not enough to tell for certain whether it would have met a certain criteria. And so I had to develop criteria that could be adapted for use in a broad range of both kind of evidentiary contexts and historical contexts. And the reason that having criteria is so important is because definitions themselves are very flexible. The definition I gave you a couple minutes ago, right? If I look at any given piece of evidence about a conflict, depending on how I interpret certain things, I could say, yes, it does count. No, it doesn't. And so I try to make my criteria as almost mechanical as possible so that I could be consistent in terms of application. And so my criteria are first that basically the conflict has to occur in the context of a polis. So this means that I eliminate, for example, cases where you have Syracusans fighting Syracusans a long ways away from Syracuse. The second thing is that citizens of the polis have to play significant roles on both sides of the conflict. So this kind of distinguishes it both from polymos, but also from something that would be a pure slave revolt or a pure helot revolt. The third thing is that citizens on at least one side are really seeking to seize or consolidate control over the polis. So this kind of separates it from non-political violence. And then the fourth one is that at least one side has to employ substantial violence. And in many ways, that fourth criterion is the most important one because it's what distinguishes stasis from episodes of political conflict, but that don't involve violence.
So what were some of the methods that you employed or even developed to begin building this quantitative picture of stasis in this period, of stases or of conflicts that met these criteria for stasis?
A lot of the method that I use is less about distinguishing individual cases of stasis, because in many ways, a lot of that work had already been done. I'm not the first person to try to study stasis on a big picture scale. So there have been maybe half a dozen or so people who've tried to do this. Most famously, Hans-Joachim, who wrote a fantastic book in 1985 that covers stasis during the same period I talk about for basically every polis that is east of Magna Graecia. And so a lot of the kind of data collection had been done. From a methodological perspective, the first thing that I did is my criteria, I think, allow me to distinguish between, cases that should and should not qualify a little bit more consistently than other people who hadn't adopted this criterial approach. But the main methodological thing I do is less about finding these episodes of stasis and more about dealing with a couple big methodological challenges. One is trying to find ways to basically compensate for the evidentiary bias of our sources. A second is basically trying to see and compensate for the scarcity of our sources. And then a third one is basically trying to figure out how much value the silence of our sources have for periods and for polis where they don't report the occurrence of stasis.
So could you maybe speak a little bit about these methodological approaches and challenges in the context of, I think, the author that people most associate with stasis, who is, of course, Thucydides. Everybody immediately will think of the stasis at Corcyra, described in Book 3, but the account that you give of Thucydides on stasis is not focused in the same way I think that a lot of the literary literature tends to be on that particular moment. And you discuss a lot of other elements of Thucydides' treatment of stasis. Could you just maybe sketch a general picture of how he takes on this issue of stasis and how often it appears in his work and the kinds of things that he says about it?
Yeah, so Thucydides is very interested in stasis. And, as you mentioned, he has this famous account of the stasis of Corcyra in 427, where he discusses it really from a kind of social psychological perspective. And I think it's one of the passages that got me first interested in stasis, and I think that's true for many people. It's one of my favorite passages in Greek literature. But I think that there are certain ways in which the power of Thucydides' writing has actually been a big problem for attempts to understand stasis, because I think that Thucydides just has such tremendous kind of cachet and authority, and he's so clearly interested in stasis that it's basically given people the impression that Thucydides must have mentioned all of the stasis that occurred during the Peloponnesian War. And this has big implications for our efforts to try to understand how frequent stasis was. Basically because, right, if Thucydides mentioned all of the stasis that occurred in the Peloponnesian War, and we know from Thucydides says that the frequency of stasis increased during the Peloponnesian War, that would then allow us to basically say, okay, we can look at the number of stasis Thucydides reports, take that not as a baseline, but as kind of an upper limit, and say that stasis was actually rarer than that for most of the time. And this has, in many ways, been, so I think this is basically in the background when a lot of people are thinking about stasis. And it becomes doubly problematic because if you look at all of the tremendous work that these historians have done identifying episodes of stasis, they basically have identified together, and so I put all their work together, and we end up with about 412 cases of stasis during this period that other historians have diagnosed. And if we look at these cases, we see four really striking trends. The first is that they're actually quite rare, right? If we take that 400 number, it seems pretty big if we take it in isolation. But if we realize that we're talking about 2 centuries and 1,000 polis, what that basically means is over 200 years, every other polis, or slightly smaller, a little bit less than that, so 4 out of 10 polis would have experienced a stasis over 2 centuries. So again, very small amount. The second thing is they're heavily concentrated in a small minority of large prominent polis like Argos, Rhodes, and Thebes. They're also heavily concentrated in periods of large-scale conflict among, what we can think of as like the great powers of the Greek world, places like Athens, Sparta, Persia, Thebes. And the last thing is that a substantial majority, somewhere between 60 and 70%, of these cases that we have in the historical record involved foreign interventions. And these are generally by one of those great powers, but also sometimes by peer polities or regional hegemons. And so basically, the picture that Thucydides gives us in the great stasis at Corcyra is then reinforced by this evidence, right? It's not only saying, okay, it's usually less common than during the Peloponnesian War, and Thucydides tells us all the ones there, so we can take that as the upper limit. Second, Thucydides explicitly says that stasis increases during periods of large-scale conflict. And third, he portrays stasis as a product of foreign intervention, right? He explicitly says that Athens and Sparta are, intervening in these polis, and that's what's causing this problem. So basically, you get Thucydides structuring the way that people interpret the evidence, and then the evidence seems to back Thucydides up. And so my challenge in this book is to argue not only against Thucydides, but also against what the evidence seems to say. And so, in short, what I argue is that this distribution of, attested stasis is actually just a product of the evidence, right? The apparent concentration, the key word here is apparent concentration of stasis in large prominent polis and in periods of large-scale conflict among these big polis is really a product of evidentiary bias rather than historical phenomena. In other words, I argue that we know more about stasis in these polis and in these periods, not because they were particularly prone to stasis, but just because we have so much more information about their political histories during this period.
Well, one thing I've always wondered about the passage about the great stasis at Corcyra is that Thucydides sets it up in his sociological analysis as paradigmatic, right? As something like, I think the standard reading is that he gives us this template for stasis, and then whenever he mentions stasis elsewhere in the work, we're supposed to imagine what happened at Corcyra as also being at work. I mean, is that kind of a standard reading of it?
Yes, yeah, I think most people interpret it as paradigmatic. I wouldn't, but I think most people do.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask you about, because, I mean, that passage is strange in some ways because while he's explicitly saying in a way that this is paradigmatic, he's also simultaneously presenting it as exceptional. So, I mean, what do we make of that? How accurate a template is that or framework for understanding other incidents of stasis even within Thucydides' own work?
Yeah, so you've put your finger right on one of the things that kind of, one of the intuitions that led me to arguing against Thucydides and against the evidence, which is, that there's a huge incongruity, right? Just to kind of restate what you said, because I think it's really important. Yeah, Thucydides both presents it as paradigmatic and says it's exceptional. And it's not only exceptional, it's the worst one ever. And so there's this tension, and I think I do think it's exceptional. I do think there's a way in which we can think about it as paradigmatic, but I think it's paradigmatic of certain exceptional cases. And so the way that I end up trying to square the circle here, and this isn't really about, when I do this in the book, it's not really about Thucydides. This is more looking at other cases that I think are more typical, which is basically that there are mechanisms that limit the level of violence in most stases. But there are also certain situations in which kind of these mechanisms fail. And once kind of stases accelerate, once they get past these mechanisms that usually reduce or limit the amount of violence, then they tend to snowball and get out of control. And I think that Corcyra is a paradigmatic, but it's still extreme even within this set. But I think it's a good extreme example of what happens in these exceptional cases when the violence spirals out of control.
Could I just ask you, what are the typical limiting factors?
Yeah, so there are a number of them. So I think that, to me, the biggest limiting factor, I don't know, there are a number of them. I'm going to focus on, I think this is probably the biggest one, which is, and this might sound odd to some readers, but it's actually the relatively low costs associated with going into exile in the Greek world, right? And I think this had two really important effects on potential stasioti, right? It makes them much more likely to initiate stases because it decreases the perceived costs of defeat, right? If you lose, you can kind of skip town, go into exile. But this low cost of exile also made them less likely to fight to death because flight into exile becomes a more attractive option. And so the first effect helps account for the frequency of stasis, whereas the latter kind of accounts for the fact that stases tended to involve low levels of violence. And so I think this, provides an economical explanation for both of the big arguments that I make about frequency and intensity. And so I'd be happy to, if you'd like, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the low cost of exile, but also give you an opportunity to ask me about something else.
Well, maybe I'll just ask you, Scott, could you give us an example of a stasis that perhaps is a little bit more typical, if you can describe any of them in that way? More typical, I mean, than the Corcyra outbreak of violence.
Yeah, so let me give you, I think talking about the typical is difficult whenever we're talking about a phenomenon that's just diverse, but especially because, one of the things that I argue is that our sources just have a huge tendency to report extraordinary cases. Right. So I do think there are some typical cases, and there's some cases I think that reveal the typical even though they're extraordinary. So I'll kind of give you, I'll give you a couple cases I think illustrate this. So the first one, and I think in some ways this, I don't want to say it's a paradigmatic stasis, but it gives you a good idea of, I think, low-level stases that were very frequent and our sources just don't care about. And this is a stasis that Herodotus reports in Chios in 480. And it's right after the Battle of Salamis. And basically after the Battle of Salamis, 7 key conspirators decide that they're going to assassinate the tyrant Stratus, who's kind of been ruling the city with Persian support for decades at this point. Unfortunately for them, though, one of them betrays the plot to Stratus, and the others flee, first to Sparta and then to Aegina, where they try to persuade the Greek fleet to kind of come and free them for Persian domination. So essentially, all that happens in this stasis is a few guys conspire to kill a tyrant, one of them turns them in, and before the tyrant can capture them, they skip town. And Herodotus explicitly describes this as a stasis. And so I think this is revealing in two ways. One, it kind of reveals just how low level things are. The second thing is that, right, I like the context of this because it's crucial to understanding why we know so little about low violence cases like this, right? If these guys hadn't happened to intersect with Herodotus' narrative of the Persian Wars, he wouldn't have ever mentioned them. So this doesn't usually happen. And the third thing is it just shows that, right, these people, they're relatively willing to go skip town because they think they have options outside their home polis. So it kind of reveals the mechanism. So that's kind of, I think, a good demonstration of the low-level stasis. Mm-hmm. The second case, which is probably my favorite case, and I think I'd still put this on the high side of the typical, but I think it also reveals the typical mechanisms really well, is this is Xenophon's account of a stasis in Elis probably in like 401 or 400, something like that. And basically you get this wealthy guy named Xenius and his followers, and they conspire to seize control of Elis and make an alliance with the Spartans. And so Xenius and his co-conspirators, they launch a surprise attack on the democratic faction. Just before dawn, they burst out of a house. They kill an unspecified number of their fellow citizens, including a guy who looks a lot like the democratic leader Thucydides. And this is really important, the fact that he is basically a doppelganger for Thucydides. And so according to Xenophon, the apparent loss of Thucydides drives the democratic faction to despair. So they do nothing to retaliate. And the conspirators, they grow in confidence. They get supporters who hadn't actually participated in the initial attack. And they kind of bring their arms and armor into the agora for a show of force. As they're mustering in the agora, though, it finally becomes clear that Thucydides isn't actually dead. He had survived the attack thanks to the fortuitous kind of existence of this doppelganger, together with the fact, and here I'm going to quote Xenophon, that he had fallen asleep in the very place where he had gotten drunk the previous night. End quote.
As you okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you do if you're the democratic leader, right? At least in Xenophon's mind, that is true, right? This is like all these terrible people, these wealthy elites who defect to the demos, they're ingrates, they're terrible. Right, so anyway, shaking off what must, if Xenophon's to be believed, have been a pretty nasty hangover, right? Thucydides marshals the democratic faction, leads them into active battle, and routs their opponents. And then after the battle, the people who had participated in this initial attack, but probably not those who had just gathered in the agora, they flee the city and take refuge with the Spartans. So I think I'd put this on the high side of the typical, right? We see this initial surprise attack, and then a battle in the agora, but not very many people die in it. So I think this kind of still falls within the typical. But I also think it reveals these mechanisms is that there basically are kind of off-ramps. So, right, one of the things that Xenophon does, and this is actually typical of a lot of Stasis narratives, is Xenophon reveals these places in the violence where he would have expected the violence to stop. And in this case, right, it's clear that under normal circumstances, right, if Thucydides hadn't passed out drunk in a ditch somewhere, or if he had, but there hadn't been like a plausible doppelganger that they could have killed instead of him, they probably would have kept on looking for him and killed him, right? If that had happened and Thucydides had in fact died, the demos would have just acquiesced to the oligarchic coup. And so what would have actually happened in this stasis is small surprise attack, they get the leader of the demos, and now you have an oligarchy. And so I think that there are basically these points where it becomes very clear that one side has an overwhelming tactical advantage in that particular moment. So the other side basically gives up, and some of them flee into exile, and some of them just acquiesce and remain under the new regime.
How often, or what is the sense that you have of how often stases were accompanied by actual constitutional change? So maybe if we think of the famous example of the coup of 411 in Athens.
I guess it's tough to say how often it's accompanied by constitutional change. I would say in a substantial majority of cases, that is the goal of one of the parties. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to necessarily say that in most cases it actually happens, because you have a lot of cases where the incumbent regime ends up being victorious. Like in this case, right? It was a democracy before, it was a democracy afterwards, but that's just because the Democrats won. You also do see some like intra-oligarchic stases where you have, two factions of people who both want an oligarchy fighting for control of the oligarchy.
Okay.
And so the extent to which we would describe that as constitutional change, sometimes some of them might set up a dynasteia, and maybe that counts as constitutional change, but that's more of a definitional question. The main thing is that in most cases, someone is probably trying to change the Constitution in a majority.
Yeah, and before we come back maybe to these issues of intensity and frequency, which are really important for you. I have, I guess, one maybe silly question, which is, you've mentioned Herodotus and Thucydides and Xenophon, these narrative histories of the period. And you also mentioned, and I think this is really interesting, that stasis differs from other types of war and that you don't have the victors typically setting up trophies. So what kind of, if any, material evidence do we have for stasis in this period?
Unfortunately, not very much. So it's really primarily textual and epigraphic. So I guess we have material evidence in the sense that we have a number, and this is one of the kind of the cool things about this field is that the number of stasis inscriptions, or I guess they're not stasis inscriptions, they're post-stasis reconciliation inscriptions, but these are actually appearing with, I don't want to say at a great rate because that would overstate it, but we have a number of new ones that have appeared, in the last couple of decades. But apart from that, we don't have that much evidence because people didn't tend to, do vase paintings depicting stasis or stuff like this. It's something that people would generally want to sweep under the rug. And this is a totally inconsequential note, but this posed big problems for me when I was trying to figure out a dust jacket image because we just don't have images of stasis. So maybe that's a good demonstration of the fact that, kind of material evidence, figural evidence is pretty rare.
Yeah, and inscribed stones usually make for terrible book covers. But could you maybe say a little bit more about these reconciliation inscriptions? Are these things that maybe intersect conceptually with our ideas about the amnesty in Athens?
Yeah, so we have a number of these reconciliation decrees. So I'd say the most famous one is a reconciliation decree from Nakone. And then there's I think I can call this a famous description from Dicaea and Chalcidiki. There's a good dossier of reconciliation descriptions for a kind of probably late 4th century, maybe early 3rd century stasis in Telos. And there's a very new inscription from Irai with another kind of reconciliation decree. Those are the ones that I'm most interested in. We also see some that kind of seem post-stasis with Athenian interventions after revolts from the Delian League. Those are a little bit different, but I'll focus on the reconciliation ones. And these, I think, provide a lot of evidence for things that are, in many ways analogous to the Athenian amnesty. And so I think there's a lot of really good work on this. I think, Ben Gray is probably the person who's worked most on this, but Matt Simonton, John Ma, Eric Driscoll, there's a lot of good work that's being done on these. And I think that I may have like a slightly different perspective on these from a lot of people, in that I think that the tendency in a lot of the scholarship is to assume that these were really effective. I tend to have, and maybe this is because I work on stasis rather than reconciliation, but I tend to have a slightly more jaundiced view of these. And I also have a bit more of a jaundiced view of the Athenian amnesty as well. And so I tend not to think that these are particularly effective.
So you're not in the Leroux camp on the Athenian amnesty?
No. And this is one where, Edwin Carawan wrote, a book on the amnesty where he has this more skeptical view, and I think that influenced me. I think one of the main things that he points out is that if you read a lot of the great treatments, and so Leroux is, I think La Cité Divisée is one of my favorite books. It's one of the things that got me interested in this. But I think Leroux and many other people who work on this just tend to think, oh my gosh, this is so amazing.
It's a beautiful idea.
Yeah, it's a beautiful idea. And people... Right, there are all of these just amazing things like the speech in Xenophon about how we're fellow citizens, and the thing that Carawan brings up is that there's all this lovely stuff, but then the way that the series of stases actually end, right, is that the oligarchs in Eleusis try to start hiring mercenaries. The Democrats in Athens invite them to a peace conference and then kills them all. And that's the way that things end. And it's just this short passage in Xenophon. And it's so easy to gloss over. And I think a lot of people have fallen victim to that temptation to gloss. Oh, no, it was that they got rid of everyone is what actually brought that. And then we also see this in other cases where you get these reconciliations, but they aren't actually effective. So if you'll indulge me with one more example. Right. So similarly in the scholarship, if you read scholarship like, Solon, the great lawgiver who stood between these warring factions, and he's like a shield between the warring party. And there's all this lovely language. Most of it is from Solon himself. And in the literature, people tend to treat, the reforms of Solon as this like incredible fundamental achievement. And I think if we zoom out, we can make an argument, and I would stand with this argument, that this is a really important moment in Greek political history, because the reforms of Solon are tremendously important. If we look at them, if we zoom in and think about the immediate context, though, they're just a terrible failure, right? They within 4 years, there's another stasis. There's a series of stasis that kind of starts in this next decade, and you basically get what the Athbal described as continual stasis until, or actually through kind of Pisistratus's series of stases that bring Pisistratus to power multiple times. And so again, we have a tendency to think of Solon as having solved this problem, but actually it's totally ineffective.
Well, Scott, maybe you could say a little bit more about these issues of frequency and intensity. And I guess I'm really curious as to what surprised you on those counts in the course of your research.
Yeah, so just to get it back, what I argue is that stasis was very frequent. So I argue that most polis experience stasis at an average rate of more than once per decade. But on the other hand, stasis tends to involve relatively low levels of violence. So most stasis involve fewer than a dozen casualties, fewer than a dozen fatalities, I should say. And many involve no fatalities at all. And so I think it's tough to ask the question about how surprised I was, because I think that going into this, I was surprised by how frequent, and I was surprised by just how low the levels of violence were. So I was surprised by how far I was able to push the argument, but I wasn't surprised by the fact that it was more frequent and less violent than our sources give the impression of, simply because the basic argument, and it was generally an implicit argument behind a lot of kind of existing beliefs on stasis, just seemed to me to be based on these problems of scarcity and bias. And so it was very clear to me that the reason we think stasis could basically like concentrated in these particular polis and these particular time periods, that's just because that's what our sources tell us about. And so as soon as I started digging underneath the surface a little bit, I started to see that all of these periods where people were assuming a relative stability, every time you had any evidence for political history, it tended to be about conflict. So you get a lot of these small polis. I mentioned Nakone, Airai, right? We know nothing about their political histories except for these one times that they experienced stasis. And so you see all these little lights of the darkness, but it's any time for so many polis, any time that there's any light on their political histories, it reveals conflict. And that kind of just persuaded me right off the bat that conflict is pretty common.
Well, given how common it is, and this is one of the seeming paradoxes that you flag right away in the book, what are we to make of the overlap between this period when there are so many instances of stasis, but then also this being really the kind of quote unquote golden age of the independent autonomous Greek polis?
Yeah, so I think this idea of reconciling, I don't want to say, I'll say pervasive stasis with a golden age, and it's a golden age from an artistic perspective, it's a golden age from an economic perspective, etc. And so I think I mentioned the fact that I got into this project in part because I was interested in the impact of stasis. And so now that I have finally answered these questions, I've gone back to that question of how stasis impacted things, and I've returned to the question of economic impacts. And I think we can make a case that, on the one hand, or in the first place, stasis wasn't as bad from an economic perspective as we might expect, given kind of the social science literature on the relationship between political violence and economic growth. And there's basically a pretty strong consensus among political scientists that political violence is the worst thing that can happen to economic growth. So stasis wasn't quite as bad, but there also, and I think more interestingly, are a number of mechanisms through which stasis actually may have been growth promoting and may have actually kind of like been helpful for this efflorescence. And so this is something that I have an article coming out in AJP in the fall that will provide a detailed argument for this.
Yeah, that's great. And I can't help but ask, is I had John Ma on the podcast about a year ago to talk about his new Polis book. And I find myself curious about whether his proposed different angle on periodization, so understanding there as the notion that there was 100 years war spanning from, say, the First Peloponnesian War to the end of Theban hegemony for all intents and purposes at Mantinea. Would that periodization, with the idea that there was this 100 years war where these different polis were jockeying for hegemony, is that more of an international relations thing, or does that align in any way or speak to you in terms of what you see in the data about the occurrences of stasis?
So I'd say I want to separate my response into a couple components. I'm very, very sympathetic to the idea of reperiodization. So I think that, just like big picture, I think I very much support that idea. The second thing is I think I would say that John's periodization does work quite well for international relations. In the book, he pushes this into domestic politics, and he makes the argument that stasis becomes much less frequent in the Hellenistic period, or maybe what he wouldn't call the Hellenistic period, in the post 100 Years War period. I think, does he call it the heyday of the polis? I think.
Yeah, I can't remember.
I might be. So I'm going to mention another book, which is Matt Simonton's book, which just, I think, came out online. I don't think it's out in print. I might be confusing the terminology a little. I know he calls the later period the heyday of democracy. And so in John's book, I think the two phenomena of lots of democracy and relatively harmonious relationships in, say the 3rd century, those two are intertwined. And I'm quite sold on the idea, or at least I'm very interested in the idea, maybe I'll say that this really is the heyday of democracy. And I think Matt makes this argument in the Greek Democracies book as well.
Yeah, so it looks like he identifies it as 362 to 146. So basically from Mantinea to Rome.
To Corinth. And so I think, so I think basically I'm very susceptible to the idea of this being the heyday of democracy, as Matt argues, but I'd say I am not sold on the idea that stasis becomes a marginal phenomenon. And again, I don't have the data to back that up, but it strikes me that John's picture of harmony is a little bit too rose-tinted. And the reason I say this is that we do get a lot of these stasis inscriptions or post-stasis inscriptions. And I just think that a lot of the evidence that we have for political history in this period tends to kind of suggest, not everyone's getting along. And so, again, I haven't done the research to make this claim with any degree of confidence, but my intuition is that things are a little bit more unstable than John would have you believe. And I think I am more sympathetic to Matt's argument that you do have a lot of democracy going on, but this democracy is still involved in conflict against people who are trying to establish oligarchies, etc.
Well, Scott, what are you hoping that people take away from your book? And maybe more specifically, what are you hoping that people carry forward in terms of your research?
So there's an empirical answer and a methodological answer. And so on the empirical answer, my main hope is that people take these findings. And again, I'm just talking about the core findings of high frequency and low intensity, because before I actually get to the answer, I want to take a step back and just say that one of the things I really want people to understand about my arguments in the book is that I'm painting with a very, very broad brushstroke. I am not trying to claim that every polis experienced stasis at this level, or even that all types of polis did. What I think we can do is we can set this figure of more than once a decade as kind of a baseline or a basis for comparison. And then I'm hoping that other people will then tackle the question of variation or diversity in a way that I'm not able to do in just one book. So again, I'm painting with very broad brushstrokes. But I'm hoping that people take this overall argument of high frequency and low intensity and then run with it, because I think that it's something that has big implications for how we understand a lot of different topics. And I'm focusing on economic history right now, but I think we could push this in a lot of different fields as well. So that's one of the big takeaways. The second big takeaway is that I would like to think that I make a case that we really, really need to focus on these big issues of evidentiary scarcity and evidentiary bias. So one of the things that I do to support my kind of arguments against the evidence, basically, is I create 4 different proxies for how evidence is distributed around the Greek world. So one of them, I look at the number of column inches in the Hansen and Nielsen inventory. This is something that others have done before me, but whereas they take those column inches as proxies for kind of performance during the classical period, I take them simply as indicators of how much we know about them, and how much we tend to focus on them in existing scholarship.
So just to clarify, this is the inventory of archaic and classical polis, right?
Yeah. And I don't take this as to say anything about what happened in the classical period or the archaic period. I simply take this as an indicator of how much we know about them and how much people write about them. But then I back this up with a couple other proxies, one of which is the number of named individuals that the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names associates with individual polis. The third one, I have a set of texts that provides most of our information about political history, so Aristotle, the narrative historians, etc. And I just track the number of times each city is referred to in that set of sources. And then the fourth proxy I have is the number of years that each that basically our narrative historians talk about for a given polis. So, for example, in Thebes, we can say that Thebes is totally absent from the narrative historians, say in 490, etc. But then we get to the Persian Wars, Thebes comes in, Thebes disappears again after the Persian Wars until about 457. So this actually lets us see the chronological distribution as well. And so what I'm able to show by using these metrics is I'm able to show for the first time just how scarce evidence is about, the hundreds and hundreds of polis that we know very little about. And I'm also able to show just how biased it is towards the, 10 to 15 polis that we tend to spend most of our time on. And so I think that I'm able to basically show the extent to which existing scholarship on Stasis has been warped by these really important biases. And I think that that's something that can be adapted to study other phenomena as well.
Other phenomena, right. Well, Scott, when you're not thinking about Stasis, what is something that you've been listening to or watching or reading or doing that has been bringing you some joy lately?
It's interesting. I'd say, well, I guess one thing is I have 2 small children. I have a almost 4-year-old. He is now abandoned saying that he's 3.5, and he says he's almost 4. And I also have a 10-month-old. And so I'd say I'm going to kind of take the both true but also somewhat easy out by saying that really spending time with them gives me a tremendous amount of joy. And I think, A, just because, it is a lot of fun, and B, it also occupies almost all of my free time. So I don't have many other options available. But I will say that as the world outside looks fairly grim for a variety of ways, my research, since I focus on political violence, does not give me a lot of uplift. And so, having kids to be able to forget about that is really wonderful. Yeah,
the kids are great. They really are. Well, Scott, congratulations on the publication of such a significant book. I'm sure many people are going to benefit from working with it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was really a treat to talk to you about this.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us.
We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.